For 3 decades, Johnny Carson controlled the most important room in American late-night television. His desk looked welcoming, his smile looked effortless, and millions of viewers believed they knew the man behind it. Inside NBC Burbank, however, there was another side to that power. Carson could decide that a relationship was over without ever announcing it. No public ban. No dramatic confrontation. Sometimes, the only evidence was that the invitations stopped coming. Among the people caught in that silence were future legends, longtime friends, major stars, and one woman who once meant more to Carson than almost anyone outside his family. Their stories reveal the unwritten rules of Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Actor number 1, Joan Rivers. In 1965, Joan Rivers walked onto The Tonight Show as a struggling comedian who had spent years trying to convince the entertainment industry that she belonged. She left that night with something far more valuable than a successful appearance: Johnny Carson's public endorsement. Rivers had been fighting for space in a business that had little patience for a woman whose comedy was fast, sharp, and unapologetically direct. She was a club comic from Brooklyn, Jewish, ambitious, and difficult to fit into the conventional image of a female entertainer in the early 1960s. For years, she had heard no from bookers. Then, on February 17, 1965, Carson gave her a chance. Her appearance went so well that Carson turned toward the camera and made it clear that he believed she had what it took to become a star. Coming from the most powerful late-night host in America, those words carried enormous weight. Bookings followed. Opportunities multiplied. The woman who had spent years fighting for attention suddenly had one of television's most influential figures standing behind her. Their relationship grew far beyond a simple professional connection. Rivers became a regular guest. She became a writer and eventually, Carson's permanent guest host. The first woman to regularly occupy that position when he was away. Carson invited her to dinner, sent her flowers, welcomed her into his home, and praised her publicly and privately. To Rivers, the relationship became deeply personal. She regarded Carson almost like a father, the man who had recognized her talent when much of the industry had not. For more than 2 decades, the arrangement appeared secure. Then came 1986. Fox approached Rivers with a remarkable offer: her own late-night talk show, scheduled at 11:30 p.m., directly opposite Carson. The opportunity was enormous. It was also dangerous. Rivers had already tried to understand what her future at NBC would look like. According to accounts surrounding the situation, she had learned that the network did not view her as the likely successor to Carson. She was 53, and the future of late night seemed to be moving toward other names. Fox offered her something NBC had not: a chair of her own. Rivers accepted. The problem was not simply that she accepted. Carson expected to hear it from her personally. She intended to tell him. According to accounts from Rivers and people around the production, she struggled with how to approach the man who had helped launch her career. She waited for the right moment. The moment never came. Before she could speak to him, Variety reported the deal. Carson learned about Rivers' new show the same way much of the industry did, by reading about it. What followed became one of the most painful breaks of Carson's career. According to accounts from the period, Carson stopped speaking to Rivers. Calls went unanswered. Gifts were reportedly returned. Attempts to reach him failed. The professional relationship that had lasted more than 20 years seemed to disappear almost overnight. Rivers' Fox show struggled. Some affiliates declined to carry it, and according to the original account, some guests were reluctant to appear because of the consequences they believed appearing opposite Carson might create. The show was canceled in 1987. Then Rivers suffered another devastating loss. 3 months later, her husband and producer, Edgar Rosenberg, died by suicide. For years afterward, Rivers continued trying to reconnect with Carson. She wrote letters, made calls, and sent flowers. There was no reconciliation during Carson's lifetime. When Carson died in 2005, Rivers learned the news like millions of other people. It was not until 2014, when Jimmy Fallon invited her onto The Tonight Show, that Rivers returned to the stage associated with the beginning of her career. She was 80 years old. She walked back into that room, made the audience laugh, and briefly occupied the same television space where Carson had once announced that she was going to become a star. Within a year, Joan Rivers was gone. Her story is perhaps the hardest of the 7 to reduce to a simple rule. She had not insulted Carson. She had not failed professionally. She had accepted an opportunity that she believed she needed. But Carson appears to have experienced the decision differently. To him, the issue was not merely competition. It was betrayal. And that distinction matters, because the next story involves someone who discovered just how quickly Carson's approval could disappear over something much smaller. Actor number 2, Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis did not enter The Tonight Show as an unknown hoping for a break. By the 1970s, he was already an American institution. He had become famous alongside Dean Martin, built a major solo film career, directed and produced his own movies, and become closely associated with his annual telethon supporting muscular dystrophy research. His fame crossed generations and borders. France had honored him. American audiences had watched him for decades. And he had appeared on Carson's Tonight Show more than 80 times. That number alone explains why what happened next was so unusual. Jerry Lewis was not simply another guest. He was practically part of the Tonight Show family. Then, sometime in the summer of 1975, something changed. The incident did not unfold under the studio lights. There was no audience watching. No camera captured it. The disagreement took place in the cue card room, one of the hidden spaces that made the television show possible. The person at the center of the incident was Don Schiff, the cue card man. Schiff's job was almost invisible to viewers. He prepared the cards that helped performers remember their lines and fed information to hosts and guest hosts when necessary. It demanded timing, accuracy, and patience. According to the accounts cited in the original story, Lewis became verbally abusive towards Schiff during a last-minute change. The card could not be rewritten quickly enough, and Lewis reportedly became angry and loud. For the audience at home, this would have been invisible. For Carson, it was not. Schiff later told Carson that he did not want to work with Lewis again. Carson listened. There was no dramatic speech. No public confrontation. No press conference. He simply took the complaint seriously. And the result was extraordinary. Jerry Lewis, the entertainer who had appeared on the program more than 80 times, effectively disappeared from Carson's booking schedule. He did not return as a regular guest host. His appearances became rare or disappeared entirely during Carson's remaining years. The significance of the story is not really about a cue card. It is about what Carson believed The Tonight Show owed to the people who worked behind the cameras. The program looked like Johnny Carson's personal kingdom to viewers, but producing it required dozens of people whose names the audience would never know. Camera operators, stagehands, writers, technicians, cue card workers, producers, and countless others created the illusion of effortless television every night. Carson depended on them. And according to the account, he expected stars to understand that dependence. Jerry Lewis had enormous fame. He had decades of success. He had a relationship with Carson that seemed almost unbreakable. None of that mattered once Carson believed a member of his crew had been treated without respect. That is what makes this story different from the others. Carson's decisions were not always about protecting his own image. Sometimes they were about protecting the machinery behind the image. Jerry Lewis could command a stage anywhere in America. He could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. But The Tonight Show operated by different rules. The celebrity was not supposed to be more important than the people making the show possible. And when Lewis crossed that invisible boundary, the door did not slam. It simply stopped opening. That quiet response was becoming a pattern. Actor number 3, Wayne Newton. Wayne Newton understood performance. By 1980, he had spent much of his life on stage. He had been performing in Las Vegas since he was a teenager and had developed an image powerful enough to make him synonymous with the Strip. He was polished, successful, recognizable, and carefully presented. Johnny Carson also recognized him. But Carson had a different use for Newton. He became a recurring target of Carson's monologue. The jokes focused on Newton's appearance, his hair, his seemingly ageless face, his voice, and, most controversially, the question of his masculinity. At the time, those jokes carried more weight than they might appear to today. Newton's public image was central to his career. His audience was often older and more conservative, and his carefully constructed identity as a traditional leading man was part of his appeal. So the jokes were not harmless from Newton's perspective. For nearly 2 years, he reportedly attempted to deal with them through the normal entertainment channels. Agents became involved. Managers contacted Carson's producers. His attorney reportedly sent letters. The jokes continued. Eventually, Newton stopped trying to solve the problem through intermediaries. He went directly to NBC Burbank. He walked into Carson's office. Inside were Carson and executive producer Fred DeCordova. According to Newton's later account, he asked DeCordova to leave. The producer did. That left 2 men alone, the host whose jokes could reach millions of people, and the Las Vegas star who had finally decided he had heard enough. Newton told Carson the jokes about his sexuality had to stop. And then he delivered a threat that he later repeated publicly. If the jokes continued, he would kick Carson's ass. There was no television audience to soften the moment. No band. No applause. No Ed McMahon. Just a private confrontation between 2 powerful entertainers. According to Newton's account, Carson stood and asked him to leave. Newton left. There was no physical fight. But the relationship was effectively over. The jokes eventually stopped. Newton had achieved what he wanted in one sense. Carson no longer used him as a recurring target. But the price was that Newton became someone Carson would no longer welcome into his world. The story is revealing because it shows the boundary between Carson's public persona and private authority. On television, Carson could make jokes about almost anyone. In his office, the balance was different. Newton had crossed that invisible line by taking the dispute off the television stage and into Carson's personal space. The joke had become a confrontation. And Carson's response was characteristically quiet. He did not need to retaliate publicly. He simply stopped opening the door. Newton's story also demonstrates the peculiar power Carson possessed. A comedian could make millions of people laugh at a celebrity, but the person being mocked could not easily answer on equal terms. Newton eventually did answer. He did it face to face. And after that meeting, the joke stopped, but so did the invitation. Some conflicts were about loyalty. Some were about control. And one was about something much more personal, the fear that the king of late night was beginning to look old. Actor number 4, Dana Carvey. In 1990, Johnny Carson remained one of the most recognizable men in American television. But the culture around him was changing. David Letterman had developed a late-night style built around irony and self-awareness. Arsenio Hall had established a younger, more energetic alternative in syndicated television. The audience that had once gathered around Carson every night was becoming more fragmented. Carson was still on top. But the landscape beneath him was shifting. Then Dana Carvey stepped onto the subject. Carvey was one of the most talented impressionists of his generation. On Saturday Night Live, he could transform himself into Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, the church lady, and other recognizable figures by exaggerating tiny mannerisms and vocal details. That skill made him particularly dangerous to powerful people. Because a good impression does not simply imitate a person. It reveals something about them. In 1990, Saturday Night Live ran a sketch parodying The Tonight Show. Carvey played Carson. The character was an older host sitting behind the famous desk, apparently struggling to understand the new generation. He seemed out of touch. He referenced a past that younger viewers no longer necessarily shared. The joke was not built around cruelty. That may have been precisely why it landed. Carvey was not portraying Carson as incompetent. He was portraying him as aging. And that was a different kind of threat. For a comedian, being mocked is normal. Carson had spent his entire career mocking other celebrities. He understood parody. But being told that you no longer belong to the cultural moment is harder to dismiss. According to the original account, Jeff Satt, Carson's nephew and later associated with his archive, indicated that Carson disliked the impression because it made him look out of touch. That distinction matters. Carvey had not merely copied Carson's voice. He had reflected a growing public perception. The world of late night was changing, and the sketch gave that change a face. Carson's power had always depended partly on appearing timeless. The Tonight Show was supposed to feel like the place where America met at the end of the day. Carvey's parody quietly suggested that the audience might eventually move somewhere else. There was never a dramatic public ban. There was no famous confrontation. Instead, according to the account, Carvey was effectively shut out from future Tonight Show appearances during Carson's final years. The phone did not ring. That was Carson's preferred method. He did not have to explain himself. He could simply decide that a relationship no longer served him and allow the absence to speak for itself. Carvey's story is especially interesting because he did not expose a private betrayal. He exposed a public anxiety. The fear of aging is universal, but for a television host whose entire career depended on timing, relevance, and audience connection, it carried professional consequences. Dana Carvey had held up a mirror. Carson did not like what he saw. And sometimes the most uncomfortable joke is not the one that insults you. It is the one that makes you wonder whether the audience has started seeing you differently. That brings us to a guest who crossed an entirely different boundary, one that Carson had carried with him since childhood. Actor number 5, Orson Welles. Orson Welles was not the kind of celebrity who simply entered a studio. He arrived with history. He had directed Citizen Kane at only 25. His work in radio had become legendary. His voice was instantly recognizable. His films included Touch of Evil, and his later work included F for Fake and The Magnificent Ambersons. To Johnny Carson's generation, Welles was more than a famous actor or director. He was an icon, and Carson admired him. But there was another connection between the two men that mattered even more. Both understood magic. Carson had performed magic from childhood. Growing up in Nebraska, he used tricks to entertain relatives and continued practicing sleight of hand throughout his life. For Carson, magic was not merely entertainment. It was craft. So when Welles appeared as a guest host in the late 1970s and prepared to perform a mentalism routine, Carson had every reason to pay attention. The trick involved apparently reading the mind of an audience participant. A person would think of information, and Welles would reveal it. The effect depended on timing, confidence, and the illusion of genuine impossibility. But according to the account cited in the original transcript, the performance did not go smoothly. Welles struggled with the routine. The audience did not know exactly when to respond. The illusion began to collapse. For most people, that would have been embarrassing but harmless. Carson, as a magician himself, would have understood that tricks fail. That was not necessarily the problem. The deeper issue was what Carson reportedly learned afterward. According to the source account, people close to the production told Carson that the audience participants in Wells's mentalism routine had been planted rather than randomly selected. If true, the revelation changed the meaning of the performance. The trick itself could be artificial. That was part of magic. But Carson believed the audience's sense of wonder had to be earned. A magician could conceal the method. The magician could create an illusion. But the emotional response, the astonishment, was supposed to come from the audience believing that something extraordinary had happened. A planted participant could make the entire reaction feel manufactured. For Carson, that was not simply a technical shortcut. It violated the spirit of the craft he had loved since childhood. The irony is that Wells was one of the people Carson admired most. That made the disappointment more significant, not less. According to the original account, Wells's appearances on The Tonight Show subsequently ended quietly. There was no formal announcement that he had been banned. His name simply stopped appearing among the guests Carson's bookers pursued. It is an example of the strange severity of Carson's personal standards. He could forgive a bad joke. He could forgive a failed performance. He could forgive a mistake. But when something touched a principle he genuinely believed in, forgiveness became much harder. For Carson, magic was built on trust between performer and audience. And the possibility that Wells had manufactured that trust was something he could not easily dismiss. The man Carson had admired had crossed a line that was invisible to most viewers. And that invisible line mattered enormously to him. But not every person who disappeared from Carson's guest list had committed an offense on stage. One of the strangest cases began with something much simpler, a television appearance that did not produce enough laughter. Actor number 6, Jay Leno. Today, Jay Leno and Johnny Carson are permanently linked in television history. Leno eventually inherited The Tonight Show desk and hosted it for more than 2 decades. His name became almost inseparable from Carson's legacy. But before that happened, there was a period when Carson reportedly did not want Leno back. The future host was still a young comedian from Boston. In March 1977, Leno appeared on The Tonight Show and made enough of an impression to return. He appeared multiple times, and by the time he reached his 5th set, the path seemed straightforward. Then came February 1978. The performance was not disastrous. The audience did not sit in silence. There was simply not enough laughter. According to the producer accounts cited in the original transcript, the response was thin, somewhere between polite and genuinely enthusiastic. For most comedians, one mediocre television appearance would not end a career. For Leno, it appears to have had a much bigger consequence. Producer Peter Lassally, who worked closely with Carson for decades, reportedly observed that Carson simply did not like Leno. And when Carson formed that kind of opinion, changing his mind was difficult. Leno's name disappeared from the booking schedule. No meeting explained why. No official rejection arrived. No one apparently sat him down and told him exactly what had gone wrong. The absence itself was the message. For a young comedian, that could be devastating. The Tonight Show was more than another booking. It was one of the most powerful platforms in American comedy. A successful appearance could introduce a performer to millions of people. And Carson's approval could open doors far beyond NBC. Leno, therefore, found himself facing the most frustrating kind of professional rejection, one without a clear reason. Yet he continued working. He stayed on the road. He improved. He built a reputation that eventually became impossible to ignore. Over time, circumstances changed. By the mid-1980s, Leno was appearing again. By 1986, he had become a more familiar presence around the program. Then history took an unexpected turn. When Carson retired in 1992, Leno became the host of The Tonight Show. The young comedian whose booking had once disappeared from Carson's calendar now occupied Carson's chair. That reversal makes Leno's story one of the most ironic on the list. There was no betrayal. No backstage explosion. No public insult. If the account is accurate, the offense was simply that one night the room did not laugh enough. And that detail reveals something important about Carson's relationship with comedy. For him, laughter was not just a measurement of professional success. It was central to his identity. Carson had grown up using magic and performance to win approval. The audience response mattered deeply. So, a comedian who failed to connect with the room could register with Carson differently from an ordinary performer. Leno eventually proved that one-week performance did not define his career. But for a time, Carson's judgment nearly became a permanent barrier. History, however, had another plan. The man who once seemed unwelcome eventually inherited the entire kingdom. And then there was one final case, a man whose problem with Carson had nothing to do with comedy at all. Actor number 7, William Shatner. William Shatner arrived on The Tonight Show carrying something most guests could only dream of. He was Captain Kirk. By the early 1980s, Star Trek had created an enormous fan following, and Shatner had successfully moved into another television role with T.J. Hooker. He had projects to promote, a famous face, and a persona built around command. That last quality may have been the problem. Shatner was accustomed to playing the center of a scene. Carson's show demanded something different. The host controlled the rhythm. The guest followed it. According to the original account, Shatner appeared on The Tonight Show in 1983 and spent an unusually long stretch, talking without allowing Carson to redirect the conversation. Carson reportedly attempted to interrupt with jokes. Shatner continued. Then the situation became even more awkward. Shatner turned toward Buddy Hackett, who was also on the couch, and began directing his story toward Hackett instead of Carson. From the director's perspective, the appearance apparently looked as though Shatner were conducting a separate conversation inside Carson's program. Then came another problem. Shatner promoted T.J. Hooker, which aired on ABC, while appearing on NBC's Tonight Show. To the viewer, this might have seemed like an ordinary plug. Inside Carson's carefully controlled environment, it represented another breach of the show's unwritten rules. The Tonight Show had a specific rhythm. Carson asked. The guest answered. Carson redirected. The audience reacted. Ed McMahon and the band helped maintain the pace. Everyone knew where the center of the show was supposed to remain. The guest could be famous. The guest could be charismatic. The guest could even dominate a conversation for a moment. But the guest was still a guest. Shatner, according to the account, appeared to forget that distinction. There was no public argument afterward. Carson did not embarrass him on television. He did not announce that Shatner would never return. The appearance simply became his last during Carson's reign. The irony is almost too perfect. William Shatner had built one of his most famous characters around command. Captain Kirk controlled the bridge of the Enterprise. But The Tonight Show was not the Enterprise. The bridge belonged to Carson. And Carson's power came from understanding exactly where the center of gravity belonged at every moment. Shatner's story, therefore, represents a different kind of conflict from Joan Rivers or Jerry Lewis. There was no deep betrayal. No damaged friendship. No personal tragedy behind the decision. It was a question of control. Carson's show operated according to rules that were rarely written down because everyone who mattered already understood them. A guest could be entertaining without becoming the host. A celebrity could promote a project without forgetting whose program they were appearing on. And the person sitting behind Carson's desk remained the person who determined how the room moved. Shatner apparently crossed that boundary. Afterward, the invitation stopped. That same silence had appeared before. It appeared again. And perhaps that is the clearest way to understand Johnny Carson's power. He rarely needed to tell people they were finished. He simply stopped making room for them. 7 stories. 7 different kinds of conflict. Jay Leno faced the consequences of a performance that reportedly failed to connect with Carson's expectations. William Shatner treated The Tonight Show more like a stage he could command. Dana Carvey made Carson's age part of a national joke at a moment when late-night television was changing. Jerry Lewis allegedly crossed the line with a member of Carson's crew. Orson Welles became entangled in a dispute over the integrity of a magic performance. Wayne Newton carried a monologue joke into Carson's private office and confronted him directly. And Joan Rivers faced the most complicated break of all, the collapse of a relationship that had begun with Carson helping launch her career and ended when she accepted a competing late-night position without telling him first. None of these people disappeared. They continued working. Some became even more famous. Some created new careers. Some outlived the television era in which Carson's approval mattered most. But the stories share a common feature. Carson rarely needed a formal blacklist. His influence was powerful enough that silence could accomplish what a written order never needed to. The Tonight Show appeared to millions of people as a comfortable living room where America's most famous celebrities dropped in for conversation. Behind the curtain, it was also a carefully controlled workplace. Carson knew who belonged in that room. He knew who could be trusted.